All right, Dr. Nee, you and I started texting about this decision early this morning. So I'm so glad you were able to join me. This was a gut punch. We knew it was coming. It doesn't make the pain any less intense or real. What was your reaction when you saw this decision on affirmative action coming down from this Supreme Court?
Well, Areva, my reaction wasn't all that different from the reaction of Reverend Al Sharpton. And just earlier today, I had a chance to join that press conference with Reverend Al and a number of some of our national civil rights leaders reacting to this decision. And as Reverend Al noted, there's lots of outrage to go around, but nobody is surprised. And he pointed out the fact that Trump, had remarked that he had put three justices on the court, three justices that were a part of pushing this decision over the top, really taking credit for this. And so, this wasn't, just your run-of-the-mill decision from the Supreme Court. This was the result of a more politicized, a highly politicized, a far-right Supreme Court. And, one of the things that he brought up and that I've been hearing from lots of different corners is that a lot of folks are worried about how folks may misuse or misinterpret this decision, particularly leaders in corporate America, leaders in higher education. Might this decision be used to further backslide from the commitments that we had heard in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and too many others to name? Might they use this decision as a way to say, we're not going to sponsor events and organizations, that are doing racial justice type work? That seems to be a major concern. And so I think a lot of folks are really quick to get out there and make sure people understand what this decision is and what it isn't. Young people will still have an opportunity to talk about, any hurdles that they have overcome related to their racial identity. It just means that in terms of scoring, the Harvard University and University of North Carolina specifically can't narrowly look at race. They can look at it in the context of personal statements, but not in any other context.
Yes, and I'm glad you pointed that out, because Justice Roberts, who wrote the majority opinion, did leave that very, very narrow window open for universities to do just that. But this is still going to be devastating. Professor Dibinga, you are on a college campus. Tell us what you're thinking in this moment about what this may do to the composition of students on campuses like yours.
Well, I fear that we're going to see what's happened in other states. When you see what happened in California, where the population of students, dropped by 50% as they said, Black and Latino students after, affirmative action was banned in California in the USC system there. I'm fearing some of that's what's going to happen. I also speak, as you know, Areva, at schools across the country from kindergarten to 12th grade, doing motivational talk on diversity. And I know that in those spaces, I'm seeing people who are starting to become afraid to even apply to these schools. We started to see this just under the Trump administration in general, as things like hate crimes and things were on the rise. And that's when we started to see more students start to get interested in HBCUs. Applications were on the rise, and parents are like, you're going to go to an HBCU for Black kids because it was considered to be safer. But now we're also seeing with decisions like this and other schools that try to implement these types of policies, there's going to be this fear of even applying, because there's going to be the belief that they're not going to get it in the first place. As it relates to the students on campuses I speak at now, including American University, we're already dealing with issues relating to diversity as it stands now and lack of representation. And so I know that on American University's campus and other campuses across the country that I'm dealing with, there is this fear that the little progress that has been made in the eyes of the students as it relates to DEI is just going to be further pushed back. And I'm really concerned about how they feel like they're going to really get involved, because one of the things we have to be mindful of is that because the Supreme Court and these guys on the Republican side, their rulings always leave wiggle room for things. The wiggle room exposes people and organizations and schools to more lawsuits because it's not really directly said. People can say, oh, this school increased their number of black students by 2%. It must be this affirmative action policy. It could not just they were actually qualified. And so schools are going to be wrapped up in litigation over this for years to come as well. And I think that's also the point of having rulings like this, ruled with language like this, I should say.
Well, you're absolutely right. And I think we should step back, Dr. Nee, and really give people a definition of affirmative action, particularly in the context of college admissions, because I think some people erroneously believe, which is why when these surveys come out, people often, the numbers skew towards people not approving of or not supporting affirmative action. And one, it has to do with how the questions are asked. But two, I think it also has to do with so much disinformation that has been disseminated about affirmative action. People think that affirmative action means take an unqualified student and jump them to the front of the line over a qualified pool of students. Give us the true definition of how affirmative action works in the context of college admissions.
That's right. Well, I think you're right, Areva. We've got to start the clock not at June 29th, 2023, but we've got to start this clock way back to 1619. Right? We got to start this clock back to 1865, right? And I think what is intellectually dishonest, and we're seeing this, from folks that are celebrating this decision today. What we're seeing from those folks is jubilation around this idea. That now suddenly it's going to be a fair playing field. If we just sort of engage in color blindness, then racism goes away, that racial injustice goes away. Affirmative action has always been about reconciling the opportunity for education, for further education, for higher education and economic mobility, reconciling, that American dream with the fact that historically Americans that look like us have been kept out of that dream, and not by accident, right? And so, this was a remedy that really started under former President Richard Nixon, a Republican, to address the systemic racism that Black folks have had to contend with by saying, okay, we will consider race as a factor in admission. This is deeply personal, Areva. I remember back in high school, I grew up in the Bay Area, and I'll never forget when one of my classmates, who was an overachiever, she had a 4.2 GPA, and I'll never forget being in the parking lot at school, and she walked up to me and said, I heard that you got into the University of Southern California. And I said, yeah, it's true. And she said, well, I guess if I could check Black on a box, I guess I would have got into USC too.
Wow.
Never forgot.
Wow.
And that was my experience, but that was the experience of so many of our listeners. There's so many people, that are sad about this decision today. It is a reminder, that we have to work twice as hard for half as much, and when we do, and we get opportunities to move forward to succeed, people like to put a little asterisk by us. Yeah. And say, well, must be because you're Black, must be because you're a woman, must be because, of this. And so, this is a clarion call to action for all of us. We can't just sort of sit and be in a state of shock about this. Yes, we should feel those things, but we can't sit in this place.
Right. We got to move forward for sure.
Got to move forward.
And I'm glad you shared with that. I've been sharing today myself in some interviews, my own personal story, and it relates to what you talked about, Dr. Dibinga, the chilling effect. I remember I was graduating high school, had been accepted into Washington University in St. Louis, but wanted to go to Chicago. and was thinking about applying to the University of Chicago, which is a much higher ranked school nationally, even than WashU, even though WashU is a great school. And I remember telling my brother that I didn't think I could get into WashU. And he says, yes, you can, because of affirmative action. They'll take into consideration not only your race, but they'll take into consideration that he and I were first generation to go to college. We were, in a housing project, all of the disadvantages that we had in growing up. And what affirmative action does in admissions is take students who are qualified, who are eminently qualified to get into schools, moves them from pile A to pile B. So pile B are all the kids that have the grades, that have the test scores, that have everything else that the schools say they require. And then they go to pile B and start looking at other things that may impact you or have impacted you. And race being one of many factors, geographically, where you grew up, what your parents did, and all kinds of other factors. And then that may move you from pile B to pile C. But you couldn't move from A to C if you didn't have the grades to go into pile B. And I applied to University of Chicago, was waitlisted, but then accepted, graduated magna cum laude, went on, got accepted to every law school in the country, graduated with honors from Harvard. And not to say, look at Areva, I'm so smart, but the reality was I was smart enough to get into those schools. But for my brother encouraging me, I would have been that student that was afraid to apply because I didn't think that I could cut it in a school as rigorous, educationally, academically, as rigorous as the University of Chicago. And so I fear that there are students like me sitting at home today who have what it takes, have what it will take to be successful in those schools, but yet they are afraid to apply because of this ruling. That's what frightens me, and that's why we have to continue to fight. As you said, Dr. Nee,